Happy Sunday, everybody. Welcome to the Science Behind with Harper Crevitz. This episode is the science behind why generations clash. So I'm working on various series under marine biology, environmental science, and brain science and psychology, which is our current series. In this episode, I'm going to cover the psychology behind generations clashing. So let's get into it. So first, we're going to start with two really big ideas to review that uncover why generations feel the way they do about each other. So an interesting study gave way to our first idea, which is the kids these days effect. And that was by John Protzko and Jonathan Schooler at UCSB, who measured about 3,500 Americans with ages ranging from 33 to 51 who were all evaluated online. So that online test measured authoritarian tendencies, intelligence, and excitement or enthusiasm for reading. So what's an authoritarian tendency? Authoritarian tendencies are personality traits and sometimes political behaviors that are characterized by order, obedience to authority, like how much you respect your elders and listen to your teachers, stuff like that, traditional values, and etc. An authoritarian person is someone who shows a sort of unquestioning obedience to authority, conventionalism, and sometimes this is related to aggression or disapproval of those who contradict that strict or orthodox way of life. Now that we know what that is, let's get back to the test. So the test revealed that those authoritarian people have one common idea, and that is today's youth lack respect for authority, and therefore older people are more likely to express dissatisfaction or disappointment in that youth. More intelligent people also like to say that younger people are getting dumber, when the reality is the level of education globally is rising. So the big question here is why? Why do older people say this? Are they lying? What's going on? And that brings us to our second idea. So older generations rely on flawed memory. And that's exactly what it sounds like, where older people will compare today or in the younger generations to inaccurate or flawed memories of their past. So comparing youth to altered memories leads to the perception of intellectual decline, that people may be getting dumber as generations go on, because in those memories they envision themselves as smarter, more skilled, more intellect than what actually happened when compared to today. So now that we understand flawed memory and the kids these days effect, what about brain science? So in here, we're going to introduce a little bit about how technology changes your brain. So technology plays a really key role in brain development, and we can see that from generation to generation. It's very different because of the access different generations had to technology. So younger generations are way more accustomed to digital and fast-paced environments, which differs how they learn and process information when compared to older generations, which have more traditional, linear, and straightforward ways of thinking. So this system has a very big word, and that is technological neuroplasticity. I know you know what technology is, but what the heck is the other thing I said? Neuroplasticity. That is the brain's ability to reorganize its structure and function. So as you get older, as you learn more things, your brain literally changes its structure. And this means younger generations' brains function very differently than older brains, literally because of access to technology, along with a bunch of other outside reasons. So research also suggests higher DMN in more recent generations. Acronyms, I'll break it down for you. So DMN stands for Default Mode Network. The DMN is a network of interacting brain regions and is responsible for self-reflection and identity, which we see a lot more in younger generations. So this higher activity is suggested to be because of a higher online presence, where when combated with social media, a lot of teenagers constantly compare themselves to what they see online, and this triggers the brain to self-reflect on themselves, which uses that DMN system. So as you can see, explaining why different generations contradict is not as simple as saying because they were born in different time periods. There's literally psychological explanation, which we're going to explore. So periodically, every generation thinks they're the best. And for centuries, these generations continued to clash because they do not understand each other. So when we think of generations, we think of age. Age is the reason that different generations exist. So we're going to explore what your brain looks like throughout different stages of life at different ages and how that connects to each generation. So you might have heard that the brain is most changeable through adolescence. So from birth to late 20s, the brain is still forming and therefore is malleable to new ideas and ways of thought. So throughout this adolescence time period where your brain is changing, you discover a few things. You discover what feels normal, how authority works, so going back to those authoritarian beliefs and people that we talked about, the speed or pace of life, and how people should communicate. So this means that boomers' brains are adapted to stability and hierarchy, Gen X is adapted to independence and skepticism, millennials adapted to collaboration and rapid change, and Gen Z adapted to constant stimulation, uncertainty, and the digital world because of the time periods they were born in. So again, we're pairing those time periods in age to psychological aspects. So you can think of each generation's brain learning a different survival strategy in a way for the time period they were born in. So obviously, these are very rough outlines of each generation and are shaped by the events of the time period and differ from person to person depending on family life, environment, upbringing, and everything that makes you you is very different from other people's. So after the brain is done developing, those patterns are locked in and defended, which doesn't mean you can't learn new things. It just means you're very concrete in what you already believe. And this is called cognitive rigidity increasing with age, which is a big psychological term. Basically, neural passageways that are used a lot become very efficient and automatic. So if you wake up every morning and your hand automatically reaches over to grab your phone, that's a neural passageway. And we also have this through thought. So if your favorite food is mac and cheese and your mom used to cook it all the time for you, whenever you eat mac and cheese, you're automatically pairing that thought with your mom. So if somebody says, hey, instead of doing that, I want you to pair mac and cheese with the thought of your dad, that new way of thinking can feel wrong, lazy, dangerous, or literally not how things should be. And this translates to when a generation thinks differently, the brain does not go, ooh, let's try that. It says, that's literally not how the world works. So here we're going to pause because there's a very big connection. So remember how your brain changes with technology? The brain defends its way of thinking after the patterns are locked in, and that happens with technology. When your brain is used to process information quickly from the internet, it stays that way. But pre-digital brains are used to depth and patience, which we see in older generations. So really quickly, another scientific process in the brain is through reward systems. So dopamine and serotonin are wired differently through experience. What are those? Dopamine and serotonin are both neurotransmitters, which just means messengers in the brain and are often called the happy hormones because of their roles in your mood, emotion, and behavior. That's all dopamine and serotonin. So dopamine is known as the rewarding molecule because it covers your motivation and focus, and then serotonin is the feel-good hormone, which is for maintaining balance both emotionally and physically. So older generations often get rewards from things like stability, loyalty, and endurance, where younger generations get reward from flexibility, meaning, speed, and autonomy. And we see that a lot where newer generations see multitasking as efficient and older generations see it as overwhelming or not thorough enough. So this forms the ideology where each side thinks the other is lazy, entitled, or sometimes out of touch, when in reality it's just the brain chasing different reward signals. So a big question I had when researching this was, because this clash is rooted in brain science and psychological ideas, is it even changeable? This question brings us to our second section of this episode, which is how to reduce generational conflict. So we already covered what generational conflict is, how it happens. Now we're going to talk about how we can reduce it. So the core problem with all this brain science and psychological aspect is that every brain is constantly predicting what should happen next. So your brain is constantly predicting, what movement on my hand do I need to make to write the next letter of my sentence, or even thinking about what you're going to meal prep for lunch next week. This is that constant predicting tendency. So conflict happens through that prediction, and in simple terms, my brain is going to predict one social rule where your brain predicts another, and both brains are going to interpret that mismatch as not a difference, but instead a threat. And this makes the key to reducing generational conflict turning off that threat response just long enough for curiosity to pop in and take over. So how the heck do you do that? Just you wait, because we're going to cover it. When someone from another generation does something quote unquote wrong, your brain says, hey, that's a prediction error in that constant prediction tendency. So most people are going to respond to that by saying that's not how this works. And that triggers a status threat in the other person's brain, which locks your brain into a fixed mindset. So throughout childhood and adolescence, you learn about fixed mindset and growth mindset. So fixed mindset is where you're closed off to other people's input or changing the way you think, and growth mindset is where you're constantly open to changing the way you think. And we want to focus on that growth mindset when we're interconnecting between generations and kind of mingling. So have you ever asked your parents to do math homework with you and they have no idea what you're doing because they learned it so differently? That's a big example of our differences between generations. So what works instead is a translation. So instead of threatening the other person's brain, instead of saying that's not how the world works, you could say, oh, that makes sense given the world you learned in. And just changing that little thing in your brain really helps, because even though you're not agreeing, the other person's nervous system is no longer threatened, and that signal drops its defensiveness. Another big shift you can make is from moral framing to adaptive framing. So what the heck is that? I'm going to break it down. So the bottom line is that brains hate being told they are wrong. Your brain hates hearing that. But instead, they tolerate being told that they are optimized for a different environment, or in this case, time period, because we're talking about generations. This little reframe switches the internal systems from moral judgment to system thinking. So instead of attacking the other person's brain, you're literally thinking about how they could think. And that is safer for both brains. So essentially, you want to lie to everybody else's brains by changing the way you respond until none of us have to lie anymore and generations get along so well. That's all for this week's episode. Thank you for listening to The Science Behind with Harper Crefitz. Once again, please reach out to thesciencebehind.media@gmail.com or comment with any suggestions for future episodes or questions you may have. See you next Sunday, where we make science make sense.